Hey, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of our music podcast. Today will serve as a continuation of our conversation about a studio in upstate New York called Kimchanda Sound Studios. That podcast served as the inspiration behind a new compilation record, which has just been released called Kimchanda Studios Collection, which features previously unreleased material by bands such as Garden of Eevee, Light of Hope, and Vicious Angel that was recorded at Kimchanda back in the early 1990s. We are joined today by a very special guest, Mr. Dean DuFresne from Louisville, Kentucky. And producer Shane is joining us from Boston. Hey guys, welcome.
Welcome.
Good morning, gentlemen.
So this is a special meeting today. Dean, Shane, and I go back a long ways. And my very first time on stage performing live with a band was on Friday, October 26th, 1984. And I was joined by these two. So we have a long history, and I'm just really honored and excited to have you guys here today.
Oh, it's an honor to be here. It's funny, in so many ways to go back to that actual first show, because I remember actually making the posters for it. We were Trans Reaction.
That's right.
I mean, that was the name of the group. I remember Shane working on the posters for that.
Yeah. This was our for all three of us. It was our first show, our first our musical journeys, and as we will fast forward, the 6 years later, doing these professional recordings at Kimchanda. This is where it all started. The three of us in my basement in 1984, and I think this is also just a very special time that the three of us actually having a conversation all together. It's been over 20 years conservatively, so it's a real treat.
Yeah. Oh, this is an absolute treat.
The 80s were a very exciting time to be a teenager, and especially to be a teenager who was performing in a rock band. So those early gigs were incredibly exciting, and that feeling unfortunately isn't always replicated later on in life. So they're just really special memories, and those early shows were just so exciting.
I remember at the time just being so excited that they have butterflies. Now going back and listening to some of those shows, you could definitely tell I have butterflies, because it seemed like we were playing songs at about 120 BPM. Everything was
a little faster than it should have been.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the album is called Kimchanda Studios Collection. It's available on all streaming platforms. And Dean, when we think about Kimchanda Sound Studios, you were really the person who brought that studio onto all of our radar. So maybe we'll start there. How did you find out about Kimchanda, and what brought you and your band at the time to record there, and what was the experience like for you?
Going back, actually, I think it was an ad in the Daily Star. You'd see like musical instruments and all that kind of stuff. I just happened to see it because at the time I was living in central New York, and I just happened to go home for a weekend and just saw the ad. So actually I called up Rob. It was Rob Misevis.
Rob Misevis.
And I called Rob up and just kind of got the, how much it was going to cost, what all was needed, how many hours we got. And then I went back to the band and just kind of pitched it, because at that time, if you wanted to play out in all the clubs, I mean, you needed a press kit, and in those days it was, some cheesy, 8x10 black and white picture, a small bio of the band, and you had to have something that was studio quality, if you will. And we had tried doing some things on a 4-track, but nothing ever, sounded good. So, with that in mind, I remember talking to Rob, and we just kind of set a date. I pitched the band on it. Everybody was on board. I think the whole thing only cost $400 maybe, or in that ballpark. I mean, I still had the original receipt, but I think it was around $450 or something like that.
Since our last podcast, one of the interesting things that has shown up, thanks to you and thanks to Chris Christensen, has been some of the paperwork that was required in order to record there. So back in those days, before you would even record, there was a little contract that you signed with the studio. And what's really interesting is that it provides details about the studio itself, including its address, the fact that it was a 24-track studio, and also the rates, how much it costs. Shane, one of the things that I noticed is that when you recorded there in July of 1991, the rate that you guys agreed upon was $1,000 for 30 hours, $20 for each additional hour, and that $1,000 included 2 nights at the lodge, which really, when you look back, seems like a pretty reasonable deal. Although at the time that was very expensive for us.
Okay, so right. So that would make sense. That was the second project, a year after Dean's first recording there, and then the recording that Dean and I did there in August of '90. Right, that would make sense, because I know that, I don't know in Dean's case if your band needed it, but with the project I did in that July of '91, we needed the extra time and needed the accommodations. We were, staying up there for, at least 2 days working on it. I think with that said, we still ran out of I was saying in the last podcast, we ran out, we were up in the night and working on all these different, sound effects and adding tracks and bouncing certain things, it just got out of hand. So we blew through that $1,000 and ran out of money prior to even finishing the mix. I know we came up with it. That's all things considered, a great deal, but it's a lot of money for kids, man. It was a staggering amount.
Oh yeah. When we did it, Terminal Rain, I remember we started on a Saturday, and by Sunday we were done. I mean, that's kind of when Rob was really mixing it. But for us, it was pretty quick, or the whole process was pretty quick. What I can't remember is if we ever used a click track or not. I don't remember using one. I think we went in, did a scratch track, and then you put the part over it, and then that was it. But I don't remember if anything was ever done to a click track. But I remember with Rob, he was it took him a little bit to get used to, just the Marshall sound, just lots of distortion.
Let me ask you this. How did you guys come together to record Light of Hope? Light of Hope is the opening track on the Kimchanda Studios collection compilation record. So let's talk about Light of Hope, how you guys came up with that song and when it was recorded, and any other interesting trivia about the recording session.
Well, yeah, I could say it was it came out of again, I was working with Vicious Angel, a little more commercial type of music. I was heavily into more progressive and harder rock. There was a record label called Metal Blade that kind of dealt with a little bit more of a heavier, but off the kind of major label type of thing. So when I mean heavier, it was a little more raw versus like commercialized heavy metal, Judas Priest, or the more glam oriented stuff that we were doing with Vicious Angel, like the pop ballad or whatever, more commercial rock. So finding out about the studio from Dean, and then Dean and myself having a deep, long history of this love of this music, and even a little bit of this, British new wave of heavy metal music, the progressive metal. We shared a love for that since we were like 9 or 10 years old. So the natural fit was like, wow, all right, well, Darren, you had just left and gone off to college. I had this kind of like pent up stuff where I wanted to record more aggressive music, but I only had a budget for one song. So I wanted to put together kind of an all-star roster. Dean was really good with this sort of music. Carl Anthony, who played bass, was another friend of all of ours. And he was a little older and had toured with all these like bands that Dean and I grew up like worshiping and stuff. So to have his input and being able to play with him was a real treat. Although he was a friend, came into this with a little more experience. So that's kind of the history. Dean and I had this rich history. We loved this sort of music. I had pent up energy. Dean had a contact at the studio, had recorded there. And, funny enough, you moved to Manhattan and we rehearsed this song at Maple Street. Like, you know, like we were gone. It's like, all right, well, you know, we kept things moving, man. It was amazing what would happen in a month. Dean would be with Terminal Rain. We'd be in Norwich doing Vicious Angel. 2 weeks later, you're gone. You're off to New York and Manhattan. And we have this whole new project and a whole nother version of Vicious Angel, all happening within a month. It's just crazy how every day mattered back then. But Dean, I'll let you kind of take over. But that's the kind of the long and short of that title track of Light of Hope, which led to all these other recordings that I ultimately did there with Darren and Peter and Chris and you know.
I remember driving. It was like in the middle of the week. I remember driving, and I was in college, but I remember driving, you know, down from Herkimer to Oneonta to kind of work on that song. And I think it really was probably the first time I heard it, and we kind of worked it out right there, and it happened real fast because I think it was just me and you. I don't think Carl was there, and I can't remember if Pete was there or not. But I think it was just me and you, just working on Maple Street, going through that song, and then once we kind of got the song down, that was the only time we ever rehearsed that song. And then it was like, all right, we're going into the studio to do it.
That's exactly what happened. It was me and you. I showed you the song.
Yep.
I didn't even like rehearse with Carl. He came down to my house in the west end of Oneonta. I played him a recording of what me and you did, and he kind of got it. And we got together at the studio, and that was basically it. I mean, that was the magic of all this sort of stuff. There wasn't, you know, months of pre-production and all this sort of stuff. It's like, hey, here's the song.
Yeah.
You know, here, Carl, here's a tape. Let's hang out for a couple of hours on my porch and just talk. And here, by the way, listen to this. Come to the studio at this time, and you know, maybe one run through, and then it was showtime.
When you guys recorded Light of Hope at Kimchanda, did you stay there? Did you take advantage of the lounge experience, so to speak, or the cabins?
I don't believe at that time, the following year, that seemed to be much more in my memory. I don't think we did that. I don't think. I could be wrong.
I don't think we did either.
It may not have even been like required, you know, like, you know, we tracked everything in one day and maybe went back the next day and I mixed it. Mm-hmm. Who knows? It could have been done in one day. I don't even know who knows back then.
Yeah, it was done in one day. What I remember was we actually used the lodge, because I remember there was it like a barbershop chair that he had that was there. I remember kind of lounging in that while we were just, you know, while Pete was doing his thing or Carl was doing his thing. We put a scratch track down on it. I mean, and boom. I mean, the drums went next. I mean, and everything went real fast. Mm-hmm. And I remember, you know, because that was the first time I ever met Carl. And I remember he came in and put his bass track down, and I was just like, wow. I mean, I was smoked. I was like, that was amazing. I mean, you know, Pete did his thing. I mean, I thought Pete's vocals were great. You know, I mean, it's kind of what he alluded to before, is channeling his inner Bruce Dickinson. I mean, you know, I certainly think he did. He performed really well.
And that was not a comfortable style for him. I mean, it really wasn't.
No, I thought he nailed it.
He did great. And, you know, but he you know, the kind of story of Pete especially, he really came into his own with the next genre of music that came in that was more, you know, that Seattle-based stuff. It really fit his voice really well. And that was always his comfort zone. He was incredible, and, you know, with further projects. But we always talk behind the scenes that, you know, this sort of stuff, it was a challenge for him. It was way out of his comfort zone, but he did a great job on it. But once again, I don't even remember working, like Darren was saying with this earlier podcast with another singer that we'd worked with. We've actually never heard him sing until we were in the studio, and it was kind of a comical disaster. But I don't even remember working on it with Peter. Like I don't remember working on it. Maybe he heard the same thing I gave to Carl, and he came in and did it. But there was like blind faith of like, hey, just show up, do your thing. It's going to be good. And
what kind of struck me about it the most, I mean, to Pete's credit, you know, lyrically, I thought, I mean, he wrote a good song, or he contributed to a very good song. I mean, his lyrics really fit, you know, the tone of the song.
Yeah, well, he's a deep dude, and I'm really glad that that's the kickoff track of this compilation, and that the tapes were found and restored to a point where I think it's a great way to kick it off, because that was a really special recording.
One of the things that I remember the most from that, from that day was I remember setting my drums up, and Pete alluded to it on the last podcast. But I mean, my drums were always tilted. Most guys kept them flat. I didn't. I just kind of kept them at probably a 30-degree angle. And I just remember people was just like, how do you play on that? And it's just, I think it was just the way in which I sat. I had bad posture when I was playing. So it's probably the way that it was, set up that way. But I just remember him just like, he's like, man, how can you possibly play, with the drums tilted that way? And I was amazed that that he still remembered that.
Yeah, do you still do that now, or was that just a fluke at the time? Because I do remember it was very, you had them almost at an angle like this. You're doing the fills.
Yeah, I still play that way, and I think it just goes back to just having bad posture. I don't, I just don't sit, straight up the way that you're supposed to. I slouch when I play. I always have.
The following year, fast forwarding slightly, but sticking to the chronological order of the album, in July of 1991, Shane, you booked another session at Kimchanda with a different project that's called Garden of Eevee, and 2 songs by Garden of Eevee are featured on the Kimchanda Studios collection, Born for War and Mind Control. Tell us a little bit about those songs. I know we covered this in the last podcast to a certain extent, but my understanding is some more trivia has come your way.
Yeah, same kind of backstory. Another year with Vicious Angel, another year with commercial music, pent up, needed to get this sort of thing out. At that point, again, trying to assemble an all-star band. Dean moved on. He was a little older. It was hard to track people down sometimes at that point, So, I was with Rob from Vicious Angel. I'm like, let me grab you. Similar relationship that I had with Dean, I had with Chris Christensen, who I kind of partnered with on this project. Chris and I had a love of this sort of progressive guitar rock type of stuff. That was like I said, a little left of center in terms of the aggressiveness. There was a record label called Shrapnel that was out in the late 80s that featured kind of shredders. So we were trying to the vision for the project was like, oh, it's going to be like something like that would be on Shrapnel Records. Just more instrumental, but more guitar oriented. Now, I know we covered this before, but 2 people that were involved in this, arguably probably 2 of the most talented musicians from the Oneonta area during the time that we were growing up, both who were no longer with us. One was Jeff Turner. He was a few years younger. The late, great Jeff Turner was a kind of a student of mine earlier on, but ultimately surpassed me in terms of talent. He was on a whole nother level. He contributed to writing the tracks on that with Chris and myself. He was a good friend of ours. He was younger, but he was a really super talent. And then Kurt, who was a little older, again, we didn't, Kurt was an incredible singer, came from more of the alternative type of scene. But yeah, some of the funny trivia, you'd have to know Kurt to kind of understand it. But here's another example. He had no rehearsals with it. This stuff wasn't rehearsed whatsoever. So Chris had to go, he had agreed to do this project, but we couldn't find them the morning of the recording. So Chris had to track him down somehow. It was like, oh, he was at a party the night before, this and that. Basically Chris had to go find them on a couch somewhere, throw them in the back of the car, bring them up to the studio. And then the professional that Kurt was and the talent that he was just handed, here it is. And again, this is, if I think it was out of Pete's comfort zone. Kurt was like a totally different type of music, although he was really talented and could stay on key and had a super talent, just not into this sort of music whatsoever. But handed here are these lyrics, here are these songs, here you go. The keys to it, no rehearsals, no discussion of melodies, just lyrics, and here you go. kind of just brought up out of, picked up same clothes he was in from the party the night before. Mm-hmm. Chris brings him up. We have to track him down, and he's in the studio with us, hung for a couple of days. It was extremely wild. I'll leave it at that. The party kind of continued. We maybe dropped him off 2 days later in the same clothes he was in before he even came to the session. It was that were crazy times. But that goes back to the point of those two tracks. Once again, what makes this collection really special is the lack of pre-production that was done with it. Yeah, maybe I had been working on these riffs and using a little tape recorder like this to record some of my guitar riffs, but I didn't even have a 4-track. So I would just, put these things together, and we would literally go up and wing it. Although I did do a little, like with Dean, I did a little pre-rehearsal with Rob. And believe it or not, Darren, I don't know if you remember this, but you came over, you were around, you heard a couple of the songs, made some great suggestions on the Born for War track. You're like, hey, you should maybe stop, do this thing where the whole band stops. That was your suggestion. Jeff Turner, came up with this great hook melody that was instrumental in the front end. So in Chris's work, and it was just a real team effort from all over. And again, outside of the little work I did with Rob and some of your suggestions, these tracks are just let's go up and wing it.
I know that when we recorded the song Fight For Me and Drop Dead in Love in December of 1990, certain themes keep repeating themselves when it comes to all of these songs. We rehearsed at this house on 95 Maple Street. That was a central hub for all of us. Incidentally, a little sidebar. There is a book called Oneonta the Novel. You can look it up. It's a book that was written a while ago, but it's about going to college in Oneonta in the early 90s. And lo and behold, what's the cover of that book? It's 95 Maple Street. Yeah, kind of an interesting time.
I have a copy of it in the garage. It's a great read. So if you haven't picked it up, Dino, you got to get it. It's great.
Oh, I'll pick it up.
Very little time was put into writing and rehearsing those songs. I mean, we basically spent a day getting together, working it out, and then went over and just laid it down, and that was it. I think that back then the emphasis was less on technology and more on musicianship. So you'd share the idea, get the basic structure and formatting of the song, and within a day you could go and record it quickly. And there's something to be said for that. I think with rock music, that's how it should be done.
Agreed. The one thing I was going to ask, you both is, at least when Terminal Rain went into the studio, you basically played the song from, beginning to end. There really wasn't any, hey, I'm going to patch you in here, patch you in here. It was, if you played and you screwed up, you went back and you just did the entire song. There was no auto pitch or auto tune. So if something, were flubbed, you literally had to go back and just re-record it. I mean, everything from start to finish.
Mm-hmm.
More or less. But it was the first time there was a little bit of that editing that was able to be done. We have actually a little clip of it, and it was like a miracle. But that's the thing that, most of the time you had to go back and really just redo it. But I think there was a couple of vocal things. I think we had that on video where Rob the producer was really excited because he's like, I think I can just, somehow just punch you in. Somehow we can make this work. And maybe there was one other time we tried that with the guitar. But to get that consistency or whatever, it was hard to do it that way, kind of like the spice in the tape. But yeah, that was kind of the deal. You kind of had to go through all the way. And there wasn't any of this really cutting and pasting of anything.
Yeah, even though it was 24 tracks, and you think you have all this room to do this or that. I mean, everything really. As I remember it, I remember going into the drum room, which basically had probably 18-inch. Concrete door. I remember just going in there and it was, all right, you do this song from start to end. And, it was, if you messed up, it was, all right, go back and do it again. There was no, hey, I'm going to punch you in here or punch you in there. It was, you're doing everything from soup to nuts, as they say. Yeah. It's been one of those things where I've never known if it was just where Rob was as a producer, if he just wasn't comfortable punching, somebody in at a certain point, or if it's just, that's the way the technology was at the time. I mean, you certainly could punch in, but with Rob, I don't really remember it happening. And I don't know if it was just it was just something he couldn't do or just didn't feel comfortable doing. But, it's like if you messed up, you just did it again.
I've mentioned this in the last podcast. The song Fight for Me is kind of special because that guitar take in the song is one take. There is no punching. The rhythm, the lead, all of it, it's literally one guitar. I think we probably recorded one or two passes, and maybe that was the second take. And it's kind of neat because it required no punching in.
I think what's unique about those songs, I mean, we hardly, utilized all of the tracks and some of the advantages of being in a studio that size. That session's really raw, really stripped down. Where like Light of Hope or the Born for War and some of those other, we were using those tracks all 24, and then sometimes maybe bouncing tracks over to even create more. I think that's how things got out of hand with the session in 91, budget wise, because we were just trying to add more and more, like 8 guitar lines and harmonies and do all this and do all that. But the Fight for Me and the Drop Dead Love is super raw and just super live, where like, there might be one guitar part, maybe one guitar track all the way through, lead, jumping over from rhythm to lead, just very live.
I was trying to remember the overall layout of the studio itself. I remember the drum room. You had like this window where, I mean, you could look out that window, and I think it was you could see this the mountain, which was a ski resort. Was it Deer Valley? Was that the name of it?
It was called Scotch Valley in the 70s, and then it became Deer Run.
Deer Run. That's the name escaped me. I've skied there many times and drove past there and just never even knew that it was there. But there was a room behind the actual drum studio, or the actual drum room. But I think those were really the only 2 rooms outside of the the main room where the board was. But I was trying to go back and just, remember the layout. So when you guys recorded, did you record, the guitars in the control room, or did you guys use the other room?
The guitar amp was set up in the other room. I do remember that, because one of the things I wanted to experiment with, and it's part of why I think the guitar sounds interesting on the songs from the December 1990 session, is I wanted to experiment with setting up 2 mics, one in front of the amp and one behind the amp. So it's got a very full sound, and one of my favorite rock recordings from that whole entire period.
So I think the only other tracks on this collection that we haven't mentioned were the re-records of some of the classic Vicious Angels songs, and then a couple of other new songs that were written that spring. Once again, you were in Manhattan and kind of coming up, and it was another one of these sessions where like I wasn't really planned out. Once again, I think you said in the last podcast, Peter's supposed to go to South Carolina or something, spring break. It didn't work out. You were here. I kind of like skipped school or something, and we just kind of once again kind of just kind of winging it. With rehashing a couple of the older songs, and then writing the new song, which I think was Fire. I think that was the only other maybe new song from that time period.
The goal was probably to try and capture a slightly more refined recording of the 2 songs in our catalog that had the most commercial appeal, the songs that for whatever reason seemed to elicit the strongest feedback. One was this 3-chord rock song called Hip Shake, and the other was a ballad called I'll Save Tonight for You. When you listen to I'll Save Tonight for You, the one thing that stands out is it's clear that of all the songs that were recorded in April of 1991, We obviously spent more time on that song because there's more texture. There's electric guitar, acoustic guitar, keyboards, backing vocals. Needless to say, a recording like that requires more time. We put more effort into that recording. It holds up. It still sounds nice. It's a good recording. Peter sounds very comfortable on that. It's within his comfort zone, vocally speaking. And even the re-record of Hip Shake sounds pretty good.
Yeah,
Not
the I'll
bad.
Save Tonight for You was really awesome to re-record that, because the first time we had recorded it, it was our first session as Vicious Angel up at the College of St. Rose in Albany.
Mm-hmm.
So like I said, with all due respect, I think we had literally like a nun that was our engineer. Yeah. And it just the sound, it just wasn't set up for recording heavy metal or hard rock music. And it was a really good song, and I think there's complexities of that song, considering our age. Mm-hmm. There's some really great chord progressions, and it's not such a simple song. So getting that, a decent recording of that, was, I know, a big priority of ours, because I think it also had commercial appeal, and it's a great song. I think it's really held up. That's one of my favorites on this new collection that's coming out. That and Light of Hope. I love that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's a certain flow to the whole set list on the compilation album, and it was a neat experience putting this record together that featured, music by our bands, but other bands, and just to get everybody involved, deal with the clearances and the licensing and everything. So it's neat because it's a collection of songs from a studio from a long time ago. The common denominator is we all had our own different experiences and writing styles, but that friendship is the common denominator.
Yeah, and it was very eclectic.
Absolutely.
And just keep in mind, if you're listening to the collection or you hear it, these stories that we kind of talked about today, with just how spontaneous this was, and the lack of rehearsals with some of this stuff, or the lack of preparation in a lot of sort of ways for it to even come out the way it did. That's it's to go back, and even I might go back and listen to it today after having this discussion and some of these memories coming up. It's an awesome layer, part of the story.
Absolutely. I think of it in these terms. We didn't have email. There were no digitized files that you could send to one another. Like, here's my guitar part or whatnot, learn this, and you can listen to it over and over again. That didn't exist. We just didn't have the luxury of emailing files or whatever, or the closest thing you could do is play something over the phone. That's where technology was at that time. So it was interesting, because it kind of, at least to me, I had to go back and think about how we did it.
It was mostly an analog world back in those days.
Absolutely. One of the follow-ups from the Light of Hope, and Shane, I wanted to ask you this, because I'm with Carl. Carl later went on to play bass in a band called Sacred Death. They were out of Syracuse, I think.
Somehow that came about based on possibly our session, or
yeah, exactly.
Somehow that came about.
Yeah, I cannot remember exactly how it happened, but I remember getting Carl Stuck's number, because the band I was in Little Falls, the singer for that band was a college roommate of the guitar player for Sacred Death, and I think we probably did a show or two with them in Syracuse years ago. But I remember they were either looking for a bass player because their bass player left or whatever. And, I think you gave me his number, and we kind of forwarded, the number on. I think he went up for an audition, and obviously he got the gig. But it was, and thinking back through everything, I was kind of like, wait a second, did Carl actually, go on to play with Sacred Death? And I think that the genesis of that was the Kimchanda studio session with Carl.
It was somehow your connection, that area, Syracuse, me ending up there somehow, now it's a long list of kind of like, regional successful bands that Carl was always associated with. He was a great guy to talk to, being a few years older and having all this experience. He got to like play in bands and open for like Saxon and Loudness and Stryper. It was no BS. It was the real deal. He's a fascinating guy to talk to. I always kind of wish the three of us could have spent more time together. Luckily, Darren, myself, and Carl had spent a lot of time together. I got prior to our session, Carl was a good friend and mentor. He went on to that band, and I think it was because of the Light of Hope session. So hopefully that helped him out a little bit. He was always helping us out. He was an older mentor, and I think that was a pretty good gig to get at the time.
So the final point I'll raise as part of this discussion, if you guys have any information about what ended up happening to Kimchanda in the end, does anybody know, or is that a mystery as we wrap up this discussion about the Kimchanda studio?
To me, it'll always be a mystery. I didn't know that it actually wasn't there until, just seeing the podcast. And the one thing I've always been curious of is if he actually advertised the studio in more, trade publications, if that would have brought more business up. Because we were using it as a local studio, but I mean, there weren't many local bands around that were actually doing what we did. So I was shocked to kind of find out that it wasn't there anymore.
Yeah, it was dead ends on my end. I had a couple of leads that I thought I could get some information. Kind of led to all dead ends. And yeah, like we were saying, that was probably, I would imagine, set up to be like a destination studio, for bands and acts out of like Metro New York City.
Right.
I know there was some talk, Cyndi Lauper, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, certain things. It makes perfect sense. The accommodations, bands come up, major recording budgets versus local. I don't know if that was just like, hey, there's a lot of downtime, we'll fill it in with local, or what happened after we left. Again, kind of pre-internet, it's hard to say. I don't know when it no longer became a studio. Everyone kind of lost touch. So I thought I had a couple of like leads that would be helpful. Not a thing, very little information out there on it. Darren and I did a drive-by 2 years ago. Everything's kind of really overgrown. It's really hard to see what's going on up there, but it's certainly not a studio anymore.
I was always curious whatever happened to Robert Misevis.
Well, hopefully this podcast somehow will reach the right person and we can find out. He was great to us. He was a funny dude, an awesome guy, lots of good memories, and he's been hard to track down. We've all been looking for him for years, and he's off the grid. God bless him, but hopefully we'll track him down because of this little discussion and collection that's coming out.
We're working on our tape.
And I'm freezing.
Any last comments, Peter?
What? Do I have any last comments? The car started, that's good. Open up!
We're working on Fight For Me, and we're just finishing up the vocal tracks.
I don't believe how clean that punch was, man. Did you hear it?
Yeah, it's
on
great.
Solo? I'm hot today, Martha.
So we may not know what ultimately happened to Kimchanda Sound Studios, but we do know what happened there in the early 90s, and that is documented on the new compilation record, Kimchanda Studios Collection. So please give it a listen on your preferred music streaming platform. We will definitely be continuing this discussion given our history. We'll have a new podcast in the pipeline shortly. Thank you everybody for watching, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you guys.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Oh.